Hi, I'm Honorary Licensed Battlefield Guide Carol Reardon. We're here in the Soldiers National Cemetery at Gettysburg National Military Park, and I want to reintroduce you to a story that some of you may have heard of before, but you haven't heard the whole story. We're standing by the grave of Private Elias Hannis. His name is misspelled, but that was not uncommon around here after the battle. Elias Hannis was a private in Company C of the 147th New York. The story, as we often hear it, concerns the fighting around the railroad cut on July 1st at Gettysburg, late morning. And in addition to Elias Hannis, in the ranks with him was his oldest son. His oldest son's name was de Grasse, like the French admiral back in the American Revolution. When the 147th New York was being raised, father and son, Elias and de Grasse, enlisted together and served in the same company. During the fighting on July 1st, Elias was hit in the leg. He was able to be removed from the battlefield, brought to a house in town, and they began to take care of him there. De Grasse Hannis never showed up after the battle. Nobody saw him fall. Nobody had any clue what happened to him. Nobody knew if he was a prisoner. Nobody knew if he was wounded and insensible and couldn't identify himself. He had just plain disappeared. Hannis' family was from Oswego County, New York. And word got back to Elias's wife, Ann, up in Oswego, about what had happened down at Gettysburg. She hopped on a train immediately and came south to Gettysburg to try to find her husband and her son. She found her husband in that hospital in the town of Gettysburg, and she immediately began to take care of him. He had ended up losing his leg to the wound that he got near the railroad cut, and she tended to him faithfully every day until finally, about the middle of July, Elias Hannis passed away. When she wasn't taking care of Elias, she would go out onto the first day's battlefield and try to find any sign of her son de Grasse. She'd look to see if there was a headboard over a lone grave. She would talk to anybody who was out there, have you seen any sign of him? And ultimately she could find out no more. Ultimately she decided to return to Oswego up in New York. The rest of the story of Elias Hannis and de Grasse Hannis isn't quite as well known. When Anne went back to Oswego, she had to go back because there was another child who's never been part of the story before. Elias and Anne had a daughter named Esther. At the time of the Battle of Gettysburg, she was 9 years old, and she'd been staying with relatives while her mother came down to find out what happened to husband and son. Now convinced that she was a widow, Anne began the process of applying for a widow's pension. A year before the Battle of Gettysburg, Congress had passed legislation that created what was known as the Widow's Pension Bill. It could provide a little bit of survivor benefit monies to the wife, to the dependent mother or father, to the minor children of soldiers who fell in the service of their country. Anne began the process in September of applying for funds from the Widow's Pension Bill. She didn't have a hard time satisfying all the requirements, and in fact, by June of 1864, she had begun to receive her regular payments. And in fact, in 1866, the Congress passed another bill saying that for all minor children of wives who were already receiving a pension, for any minor children, in other words, children under 16, they could apply for an additional $2 per month. And in Esther's name, Anne applied for the extra funds and received them as well. Things came to a halt, however, in 1867, when Anne decided to remarry. She married, and as soon as she did that, she had to give up her widow's pension. Young Esther was able to keep her extra $2 a month, but only until 1870, on the very day before she turned 16. The government wasn't very efficient about paperwork, except for one thing. They always seemed to know when a minor child was about to turn 16, and they pulled the plug on the payments. The story is a fairly typical one for a widow who lost a husband here at Gettysburg, who had a child to support. What made this case a little bit interesting to me, however, was all this. A lot of times when widows are making a case for why they needed to get payment from the government. They made their case as dramatic and as full and as emotional as they possibly could. In all of her efforts to receive a pension in the name of her husband, Elias Hannis, she never once mentioned her son DeGrasse, who was missing in action and whose fate remains unknown to this very day. I'm Honorary Licensed Battlefield Guide Carol Reardon, and this is the rest of the story.